She just needed someone smart to switch over and play the bass. So for anybody that's thinking about it out there, it's exclusively for smart people.
It should be for smart people. I think, sadly, a lot of people think the opposite. They're like, we see that kid, the drool's kind of coming down one corner of the mouth.
No, that's the drummer.
Yeah. That's the drummer. Yeah, right there. Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I appreciate you tuning in to this episode. Visit our site at contrabassconversations.com and check out all the details of what's going on with this podcast. And, I'd love it if you sent me an email. My email's feedback@contrabassconversations.com. Tell me your story. I'd love to learn more about you, so reach out. I respond to every email I get, and I'd love to hear from you. And this week, we're doing something different with the podcast. We're sharing 5 stories, 5 musicians who didn't wait for opportunities to come their way. They went out, they hustled, they created their own opportunities. And that's what we're talking about today with Danny Ziemann. Now, Danny is a bassist, he's an educator, he's a composer, and he's an author of The Lowdown, which has 2 volumes now. The second volume just came out. And the first volume is a guide for creating supportive jazz bass lines. And volume 2 is a supplemental resource and it's filled with jazz bass line examples and other information. And in addition to talking about these books, we get into Danny's experiences studying at Eastman with Jeff Campbell, his whole approach to education, his philosophy. It's beautiful. How he teaches jazz, how he approaches teaching concepts like bass lines and improvisation and much more. It was a great conversation. Danny's a great guy. So much fun. I know you're going to enjoy it. Here we go. Everybody about your early years in music. What was your first musical instrument?
So my first musical instrument was actually it was a gift from my grandmother when I was like 6, which is a classical guitar. That was it was like one of the cheaper like first act guitars, and I played it until it snapped in half.
Oh no!
when I was like 9. So I'm like, well, this is a sign. So then I got an electric guitar and actually started off on violin. And played that for about 6 months. And then my orchestra teacher in 5th grade was like, hey, we don't have any bass players in our orchestra. I was really hoping that you could switch. You'll be great, blah, blah, blah. And I was just like terrified of change. And I said, no. And then she's like, well, one of your best friends is doing it. And then I said, yes. And that was the end of the violin. And I'm fortunate because my hands are huge. So I probably would have just crushed the violin. The bass was a better fit. But yeah, so I switched over in 5th grade, and I found out afterwards, actually, this was a nice little compliment, but she said that she just needed someone smart to switch over and play the bass. So for anybody that's thinking about it out there, it's exclusively for smart people.
It should be for smart people. I think, sadly, a lot of people think the opposite. They're like, we see that kid, the drool's kind of coming down one corner of the mouth.
No, that's the drummer.
Yeah. That's the drum. Yeah, right there.
So I played violin for just a minute, and then also played guitar at the same time as playing bass, which actually helped me a lot with just imagining, oh, well, there's a kind of a fret like right here, or I could, just sort of get the fingering patterns together. And then sadly quit the guitar permanently when I was like 16, and bass sort of just took over. And it's not because there's only 4 strings, but personality wise, I seemed like it was a good fit for me. And also I never really liked being in the spotlight, and the bass player was always just a person that was holding everything together from the back. So that was a way to still be musically involved 100% of the time, but it was more just about making supportive decisions for other people. And that was really made me love it and stick with it.
The beautiful thing about bass players is a different kind of personality that goes to the bass versus like violin or trumpet or something like that.
I think part of it might be because we're not really in competition with each other. I mean, we are competing for certain gigs, but I mean, bass is a function. It's not just, I mean, violin is, it holds a function, but like bass, it's like, Jeff Campbell makes this joke, like we're the only instrument with our own knob on the stereo.
That's true. I like that.
Right. So there's just always a need for it. And that's why I feel like our community is, it's based around supporting each other and not necessarily trying to build up walls or divide each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so I enjoyed that element growing up, and I had a lot of people around me, a lot of teachers that really supported that notion, which is great. A lot of friends that were doing Suzuki and really just like, they were in the Suzuki canon and they were all just practicing hours and hours and hours a day. I was like, yeah, if that's what the violin life is like, then I'm kind of happy that I didn't end up ultimately pursuing that.
So what was your thought process like as you started to look for schools, in terms of looking at schools and in terms of degrees? What were your considerations?
So, so I applied to 4 schools, and I mean, growing up in Buffalo, I was close to Eastman. I was doing a lot of their pre-college classes and ensembles, and actually 2 of my high school teachers went to Eastman. One receiving his doctorate in education and the other one receiving his bachelor's and master's. So I had somewhat of a connection to the school, and I was able to go see concerts there and meet some of the professors. So it's that was always like my sort of dream school. And I think one of the things that I appreciated the most about it was that it had a dual education program and a dual performance program, which a lot of schools are starting to do now, but when I was applying, it wasn't as common. So that was sort of a stipulation for applying. They just had to have both options available.
Now, a lot of young people that I talk to, even if they have a possible interest in education at some point, they worry that degree is going to interfere with their studies or hold them back in some way. And I just love to know your thoughts on that, because I went back to school and got an education degree after getting a performance degree. And I thought to myself it would hold me back. And I have a real different perspective now, a couple decades later.
Yeah, totally. And I would love to hear your perspective on it too. I think for me, people think that you're going to lose time to practice and, it's going to make you a worse player or whatever. And I think the thing that I really got the most out of was that it taught me how I learned, because your goal, it's not about teaching someone, okay, this is how you play like, spiccato. Like you can do those little, 1-point lessons and sort of like upper level thinking. But like when you hand an instrument to somebody for the first time and you have the ability to influence exactly how they learn things and how they understand, and, it's like learning manners for the first time in kindergarten or preschool, like that sets you up for the rest of your life. So in order to do that, you have to understand how you learned from the very beginning, and you have to understand how to deconstruct an idea to its most fundamental element and build it back up and explain it to other people. And I think in doing that a lot throughout the ed degree and learning how I learn and learning how other people learn and how to communicate, and then having to teach people fundamentals of like walking bass lines and just how to hold the darn thing, it really made me a much more musical person, probably more so than if I had just, at least for me personally in that program at that time, probably made me more musical than if I had just chosen one program to do, which was really powerful. It instilled a love for teaching, but just like understanding how things work. And now it's set the pace for how I practice and how, just like I said, I just understand how learning actually works.
Everybody ends up teaching pretty much. I mean, maybe like 1% to 2% of performers don't teach. Just about everybody ends up teaching, and it becomes such a key part of what they do. I mean, I think that some of the major players I know see themselves at least as much as teachers as performers. And I think that's true in all disciplines, really. So just getting an understanding of how to do that, I just don't think that that's going to hurt you. And I can't remember if it was Jeff Turner or who it was, but somebody was talking about music ed versus just a straight up performance degree. And I think his thinking was, look, how many hours a week do those classes really take? Are you telling me you don't have enough time in the week to still practice and develop your craft being a music ed major? That doesn't make any sense. I just don't see it holding you back. The only way where it might is if you go to a school where they kind of pigeonhole you as an ed major and you don't get to study with the person you want to study with, and you don't get those opportunities that the performance majors might.
Yeah, totally. I think, in those instances, just like hard work beats talent all the time. So you can make up for it that way. But I think there's something about, we're tapping into something a little bit deeper, which I think is, educating others. Like that's providing a safe space for other people to learn and be vulnerable and try and grow. And I think music is like, it can be self-indulgent and it can be communal, but I think teaching is all about creating community for other people. And I think that is the humanistic element. It strengthens the community. It's good for the soul. And I think that's the stuff that permeates the music more than just what we can do technically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. No, I like that a lot. So Jeff Campbell, obviously major influence on you playing wise. Talk a little bit about what his teaching style is like. He's somebody that I've probably had at least 6 or 7 of my own private students go and work with him in some capacity, and they just rave about him. What's he like as a teacher?
So Jeff Campbell, I remember on the first day of lessons, we walked in, and I won't do my Jeff Campbell voice, but it's like, Dan, my goal is to be as useless to you as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And that stuck. And I was just like, well, what do you mean, Jeff? And he's like, I am going to teach you how to be your own musician and how to practice on your own. So as soon as our lessons are done, you can keep on learning. And that was really, really powerful, is being given the tools to think on your own. I mean, a lot of people just tell you what to do, but he didn't want any of his students to sound explicitly like him, which was cool. So working with him, like I don't know if you know him, like personally, if you've had time to talk to him, or just spend some time with him?
Nah, sadly, no. One of these days.
Okay, so yeah, he's great. And Jeff is like, he's like a modern day Renaissance man. And the only other way I can describe him is he's just like, he walks the walk, he talks the talk, like top to bottom, just all around, like really supportive, well thought out, incredibly smart, pragmatic man. And he reflects that in his bass playing and his teaching. So like you go to his house and he like rebuilt all the cabinets. He like changes the spark plugs on his family van, has like steam heat in his house that he goes and fixes. Like he's just like a nuts and bolts kind of guy. So in his teaching and in my learning, we spend a lot of time just understanding like, okay, this is how you produce a good sound. This is how you arpeggiate your chords all throughout the bass to learn your keys. Like everything was just practical, like understand functionally how it works. And then we would, for upper level stuff, you'd be like, okay, I want you to transcribe this Wes Montgomery guitar solo. And let's talk about just maybe 2 or 3 of the things that make this special. And then how we can apply that into our own playing. So he held a high standard. He was really systematic about how he went through things. It was just all about the fundamentals. Being in music school can be hard when you want to play Bach or sound, like Christian McBride, or play really fast lines and solos. But he's like, no, like do the fundamentals. That'll carry you through the rest of your life. So it was really like, I'm still, 5 years later, and actually I'm about to go study with him again, but 5 years later, I'm still thinking about everything that he taught me every single time I pick up the bass.
Yeah, that's one of those marks of a great teacher. It's amazing to think about. There's a jazz pianist named Mike Coker that I worked with quite a bit. He runs I think, Arizona State Jazz Department. I think that's a school now, but he was at Northwestern for many years. And I don't know how many times I talk about that guy in a given week, but so many times, because he just gave me such valuable, in the world of jazz, in the world, just good teaching principles and good ways to approach fundamentals. And you do a lot of teaching now through the Eastman program, and I'm sure you have private students outside of that too. How do you approach fundamentals in your own teaching?
Interesting question. So, I think part of it is just reflecting on what I learned from my time at Eastman. So I studied with Jeff and James Vandermark, and they just taught me also the importance of, like, even for beginners, just like really solid fundamental setup. Just, like I said, teach them their manners on the instrument. So just prepare them to be able to hold it without pain. So like so my job at the Eastman Community Music School is I am the jazz bass teacher. So, fundamentals, like playing the bass is playing the bass, and your decisions are guided by the repertoire you choose to play. So part of me there's a little bit of an internal struggle. Like, do I get them playing jazz right off the bat? Like, I would feel more comfortable giving them the bow, but they're paying for jazz lessons. So usually what I'll do for total beginners, the first lesson is, this is how you hold the bass. Now show me you can hold the bass. Like, okay, get that out of the way. This is how we produce a sound for a jazz setting. Work on our open strings. And then by the time they leave, they can usually play some semblance of an F blues only in half position using basic 1, 4, and 5 chords. My goal is to get them playing music as quickly as possible. And then, all the stuff about, like hand positioning and everything, like we figure that out as we go along, but I try not to harp on it too much. I just try to get the music in their ear and the sound in their ear so they can have like an empathetic connection to their instrument, and just channel the ears to the fingers as quickly as possible. And then, spend time doing that, and then introduce scales. I have a system where I sort of navigate through, I just call it the circle of fourths, because the bass is tuned in fourths. So we start in F and then add one flat at a time, doing blues eventually in all 12 keys, and doing like 1-5-1 arpeggios associated with it. And usually about after a year or two, they understand how the bass functions, how to navigate through and up and down and around, how to produce a good supportive sound. And they can play tunes, they can play melodies, they can play bass lines. And I always try to make sure that a new student has an ensemble to play in as quickly as I can, so it gives them some context for actually playing the bass.
Yeah. There's nothing like bass is one of those instruments that's made to work with others. I mean, I love playing solo pieces, but it's a little weird to work on bass and not have anyone to play with. Totally. And that's what I tell them. I was like, if you played an ensemble, you would expedite your progress like times 3 or 4. Yeah. Now, you mentioned the bow earlier, and it's one of those skills that I feel is necessary for everybody, and it's helpful in a jazz context. But you're right, like you said, like if people are there for jazz lessons, it can be kind of a tricky thing. How do you balance teaching the bow with all the other things that you work on with students? Yeah,
so some students, if they're younger, like if they're in high school or middle school, their parents want them to do like an all-county solo. So I always, a good number of them are doing that. So I make sure to talk about, just like drawing a good sound, and, like we spend some time on classical repertoire. Otherwise, if I want them to, like I said, have a better understanding of how plucking works, I might just make the comparison to the bow. Like, hey, we've got contact point, speed, how fast you release it, blah blah blah. There's all these different connections we can make. So for that, other times for students are walking bass lines, but it's a little bit out of tune, I'm like, you got to bow it. We'll get that in there. And generally, I mean, my thought on developing a vision for the fingerboard, if you don't have an understanding of playing in tune with the bow, then I really feel like our lines and our ideas at best will be a close approximation, just because we don't have an understanding of absolute pitch. Because when you pluck, you're already pulling the string so it's out of tune, and then when it's finally, when it hits the point where it's vibrating consistently, like that's when you settle on your pitch. But right off the bat, we're squeezing, we're pulling, and like you can't really learn to hear as in tune that way. So usually it always finds a way to get in there, whether it's just working on repertoire or just like, okay, we'll pick this up and try it and see what it's like to play in tune now. Like, oh wow, like this is way different. So that, and I usually have, at some point my students will learn Bach, whether it's on the bass guitar or upright. It doesn't matter how hard it is. Like that's, it's like you want to learn about voice leading, pick up the bow, spend a year doing this. It's not going to be super fun. It might be a little painful, but you'll learn a lot.
Yeah, I don't think any musician was done a disservice by having Bach introduced to them. It's like
no.
Now, You mentioned bass lines, and of course, you've written a baseline book and now a second book. And how cool is that to be doing at your age too, like on your second book? That's amazing. And I'd love to hear about what inspired you to write the first book and then maybe the second book as well. Maybe just talk a little bit about the story behind these books.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started teaching at SUNY Oswego, I think when I was, I have to do math now, 20, started teaching when I was 22. I was like pretty freshly out of college. And I had a couple students that were trying to learn bass lines and learn how to walk. And they were asking for resources. So I went to the school library and I got as many books as I could on jazz pedagogy. And there weren't many at all. I mean, there's, Chuck Scher's book and The Evolving Bassist, which is like Rufus Reed's text, and it's great. And I checked out Ron Carter's book and a couple other things. But the drive to create the book was, one, just a necessary need for material. And two, because, jazz pedagogy is such a blip on the radar compared to, the other institutions of learning that we have, like Suzuki, and I mean, even further back, piano. I mean, it's just so new that it's, the field's kind of exploding, and we're at a point where we are. It's an academic. Jazz is an academic institution now, and there's no stopping that. We can't go back in time and prevent it from being studied in schools. And I think for me, what was really important was understanding that there's a need for this, and trying to. I wanted to establish a way to learn how to play jazz bass with musical integrity. So that was the driving point for me. So I spent, a good part of a year just like looking at these other texts. I think I read John Goldsby's book too, which is just like a thesaurus of information. But I read through all these books and I said, okay, what do these all talk about? Or what do they all have in common? And a lot of it was just note choice and patterns. But then there was a lot missing about, how to discern between what sounds good and what doesn't sound good. And there was a lot of assumption that students had X amount of knowledge when it's like, well, there are really no beginner books. So to just assume something is, you're leaving out a big group of people. So I was talking to actually John Clayton about the book when I was getting some feedback, and he's like, you want to make sure that you write this for, and no offense to people that live in Idaho. He's like, you want to write this? It's like, you want to write this for the kid in Idaho that has a bass, a record player, your book, and no jazz club for 500 miles and no teacher. He's like, that's a good point. So I tried to write this as a means of just from the very, very beginning, from the first time you pick up a bass, like this is how you produce a supportive sound. This is my hierarchy for learning. It's, sound, and then you get your time together, and then you learn just really simple, they call them formulas, but really it's just like arpeggiate the chords and introduce one chromatic note, then two chromatic notes. And it gives system for understanding how to play supportively, maybe in the same means. And I'm not claiming to be these people, but like in the same means as like Beethoven or Mozart, like what do good bass lines have in common? And then just from the very beginning, just try to set the student up to understand, oh, okay, I want to be as supportive as possible. So how do I make supportive musical choices?
Yeah, I love the way your book is laid out. I remember looking at the first time I looked at it a couple months ago, and it almost reminds me of the expressive techniques for strings or some of these other books that you might use in a classroom setting. That in its clarity, you start like in those types of books, you'd start with say G major scale or D major usually for that, and then talk about how here's this, and then you just introduce one new variable, and it's very clear even in the layout on the page. Clarity is the first word that comes to mind when I think of it. It's a really good way, in my opinion, to introduce that. And yeah, it's interesting. Like jazz pedagogy, yeah, it goes from 0 to 60 with nothing in between. It seems like.
Yeah, and I think that and I appreciate your compliments, by the way, because I was going for clarity as much as I could, and this hopefully will serve as, I don't want it to be a race for other people just to put stuff out there, but I want to inspire other people to think about it too. Like my goal is to have a series of these books and just, jazz, like I said, there's nothing stopping it from being studied in schools. So we might as well just treat it with the highest degree of respect possible so we can continue the tradition, on the same trajectory it has right now. And part of that is just inspiring other people to want to teach and educate and help other people learn about this.
So what's new in the second book? What's the evolution of this series?
So the first book has examples for each formula, but it's not thorough. It's just a clear example of how the formula functions, maybe a chorus or two of baseline, and then it goes on to the next chapter. So this project was born out of a need for just more clarity in the examples. So essentially it's 200 pages. The first 150 are baselines written over the blues and rhythm changes forms. So there's, I think each chapter, so it starts in F, gets you in half position, and then you'll have 3 choruses over method 1, 3 choruses over method 2, 3 choruses over 3 and 4, and then I've got just melodic baselines that I wrote out. They're absent of any method. It's just what I would play if I was on a gig, just by myself playing solo bass lines. And wrote those out. And yeah, so it goes through all 12 keys, essentially. And there's some pedagogy written in there, so it'll be a reminder below, maybe like, say, measure 1 of the F blues using method 1. I'll just have a little short reminder saying this is what's guiding this bass line. And then, I make some deviations just because I'd rather preserve musicality instead of, the formula. And it gets to, as you dig in further, there are different considerations made for each key. So I actually wrote every single one of these bass lines out by hand when I was on tour. It took me about 3 months. I just have a notebook of like 200 to 300 pages of bass lines. Like I said, in all the different keys. And the other thing that guides it is different motives. So I'll be like, okay, this bass line is based on the motive of a major sixth, or this one has a lot of pentatonics, or this one has melodic pedal point, or, substitutions. And I usually make a little note about that, just so if people are working on sight reading, they have a little bit of an idea how to prepare their hands for shifting so they can have a little bit more foresight. But basically, it's almost like a quarter note etude book. So if you're writing bass lines and need an example, you can open up to page 45. If you just want to be able to read something over the B-flat blues, if you are a high school band teacher and you're playing, B-flat blues with your band and your bass player has no idea how to read changes, copy and paste.
What a great idea to lay them out like that. I'd love to know, so you've got a lot of detail about how to develop bass lines, how to work on bass lines. I'd love to know your approach just to learning tunes in general, like what you do with students. Obviously, learning how to craft a bass line intelligently is so important. What's your approach to developing other skills that you need to be successful on a gig?
That's a great question. So I guess just in the way I learn, not if I was teaching other people, but for me, sure. I tour with this band, this band leader named Gordon Webster, based out of New York City. We play swing dances and Lindy hops, essentially all over the world. And when it comes time to do the tunes for those gigs, like I don't find out who the singer is usually until we're at the gig. And he's got a rotating list of 3 or 4 singers probably. We'll do maybe 100 tunes in a night, and I may know half of them really well and a quarter of them like kind of well, and like never heard of the other 25 that we might be doing. And he'll just look at me and he'll say, this one's an F, and then we'll just go. And he'll play it, and he's really clear about his voice leading. Like he'll be able to kind of give me the change a beat or two before it happens. But most of the time, like I just learn tunes on the gig, and that they just kind of stick. And I think I learn best when all the all cylinders are firing. When there's a lot of pressure on, I kind of have to be able to do it. If I'm teaching, so that's for me. It's just kind of like I've trained myself to be at the point where if I just listen to something, if it's a standard and I'm not dealing with 5 chords per measure, I can usually just pick it up in one go. If I'm teaching other people to learn tunes, if they're beginners and we have the time to do it, I always teach them the melody. Actually, so I taught a camp for Eastman last week, and I had a jazz combo that was 25 people. It was like half the size of an orchestra. There
Wow.
yeah, yeah, right. Tuba, like 2 guitars, like 9 violins. It was a pretty crazy combo.
Very, very standard combo instrumentation there. The 9 violin combo.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, it was old school. And I had an hour to work with them, and I was like, what the heck do I do? So I taught them, the first day we did Bag's Groove. So I taught them all the melody. I taught them how to sing the bass line, just really simple bass line. I taught them how to sing the thirds and the sevenths, like the inner moving part. And then I taught them 2 harmony lines. And by the end of that first hour, everybody could play the melody. Everybody had a context by understanding the bass line. And they understood how the harmony moved. And they understood the harmony parts, like to the melody. And it was pretty wild. For the people that didn't quite get it, the people that were strong players and understood it were able to share that information with others. We did that with Autumn Leaves, which has more functionality in the chord movement, and they were still able to get it. Melodic sequences in the melody, some different thirds and sevenths and resolution points. And I think that's one of the most effective ways to teach is just do it by ear, so they have it in their aural. And I think handing a lead sheet to somebody, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want it to stick, like I said, just giving them all the elements, the thirds and sevenths, the melody, and especially just having everyone able to sing the bass line has, for me, been the most effective way. It's time consuming, but it's only time consuming in the beginning. And then eventually, when you go to a gig and you see people, you see a jazz group, like there's a possibility if they're not using charts that someone may not know one of the tunes that they're playing. And you just have to be able to hear your way through it.
And that's one of those skills that I think just terrifies classical players. So that's interesting to hear your approach, because I think that's a leap that's really hard for quote unquote readers to make, is to just get off the page. I was interviewing Jerry Fuller, who used to play in the lyric opera. He's been in the world of business for a long time, and he's discovered the world of jazz recently, late in life, but he has found it fascinating. We were talking about this subject and just how that shift, it being more of a aural, AURAL art than the way that classical people often conceive of it, as like a page-bound art. Even in a symphony, everybody's got the music there and you're making notations. It's just such a different way of music making in a jazz context. Yeah,
it's interesting. And I feel like one of the best skills that I got out of learning how to listen was just to be a more empathetic musician. And I think, that's something that Larry Grenadier talks about a lot, is just like empathizing with those around you. And that's part of why he and Jeff are such fundamental players in their playing. It's like you want to just give the basic information that you need and then allow everybody else the opportunity to do their thing. But talking about, playing like the wonderful world of jazz and listening being an aural art, I think those skills are really so translatable to playing in an orchestra, because you have to know, it's a classic, but you have to know how your part fits in with everybody else. And it's almost like being a puzzle piece in a 150-piece puzzle or a 100-piece puzzle and never knowing what the big picture looks like, because you're just like, well, I'm in my own piece, I'm in my own place, versus being able to zoom out and be like, oh, now I understand how I fit in with everybody else to create this big picture. And even just knowing okay, well, on the bass, I'm playing E on the G string, and that's the third of this chord. And now I'm moving to E flat, which is the minor third of the minor 4 chord going back to 1. That changes your perspective of how it fits into everything, instead of, well, E for a half note, E flat for a half note to D or whatever. And it's not a huge thing to be aware of, but I just feel like it again, talking about that community and that heart of the community, with educating, you can do that with the musicians you're performing with, just by having a little bit of a better understanding of how they function and how we all function together.
I like that phrasing, the empathetic musician. That's great. That's kind of what we should all be doing.
Totally.
In whatever we're playing.
Or empathetic conductors, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Of which there are some and others are not. But
yeah, totally.
Now you're doing a clinic at Prague 2016, and obviously you're active in all sorts of different scenarios. But maybe just tell folks a little bit about what that clinic's going to be covering.
Yeah, so I'm still shaping some ideas, but I really think it's just about 2 things. One, giving people a musical way to teach how to walk bass lines, so similar to the lowdown. But two, just I wanted to use it as an opportunity to put the bug in people's ears just about thinking about jazz-based pedagogy. And, I think one of my goals is I don't want to be a martyr for the cause, but I want to, like I said, establish some sort of precedent for just we should be thinking about this. We should be talking about this as a community. And I think it's not going to be a soapbox moment, but it's going to be used as an opportunity to try and say, let's all do this as musically as possible. Here's the way that I did it. Here's how I go through it, give them a semblance of my pedagogy, and then talk a little bit about what I find important, and then use it as almost like, I guess, a bit of an open discussion.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Wow, you're going 1,000,000 miles an hour. That's exciting. Multiple books, clinics all over the place. That's so cool.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Danny, for the great chat. And folks, be sure to check him out on his website, DannyZiemann.com. And thank you so much for listening to this episode. I appreciate it. I know Danny appreciates it. And you could be spending your time doing many things. I'm well aware of that. And I'm so honored that you're spending time listening to this podcast, learning with me about Danny, about this music world that we're all living in. And if you could visit our website, ContrabassConversations.com. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, it's super easy. There are subscribe links there. You can sign up for my email list. I'll send you an email when these episodes come out. I'd love to stay in touch. Send me an email, feedback@ContrabassConversations.com. Facebook, Twitter, we're everywhere. Reach out and join this community that I'm a part of, that Danny's a part of. It's exciting times we're living in, and I'm so thrilled to be covering this. I have a great time doing every one of these podcasts, and I can't wait to bring you another podcast soon on more life on the low end of the spectrum.